The ABC was forced to cancel their drag queen story hour for children aged 3 to 5 after what they called a hateful and offensive response. South Australian Senator Alex Antic was one of those asking whether an event like this was sympathetic to the views of mainstream Australia. And he joins me now. Senator, are you responsible for this hateful and offensive response the ABC is complaining about?
Well, I mean, you have to ask them, Rita. I mean, I was asked to comment on it, and I stand by those comments. I mean, I think it's, not uncommon for the ABC to be focusing on these sorts of events. It strikes me they talk a big game on diversity and inclusion, but that doesn't seem to extend to political thought or the things that are of interest to mainstream Australia. I mean, when was the last time you saw a fishing show or a motor racing show or anything like that? But they're quite happy to cover these events. So, look, I don't know, but I don't think that you'd get too many Aussies that would think covering drag queen story time in front of 3-year-olds was a reasonable thing to do.
Motor racing, fishing. Senator, check your toxic masculinity. The ABC would be horrified by those suggestions. But the ABC's desire to push this sort of a radical gender theory and have drag queens perform for little children, I've got to say, is a little concerning. Why is there such an obsession by so many on the left these days to push this agenda on very young children?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and I think I can safely say I don't really have any particular problem with drag shows. I've never been to one. I've never participated in one. It'll strike you as extraordinary to learn. But the problem here is the exposure to these events in front of children. I just don't think anyone, I think you could take 9.5 out of 10 Australians would agree with that statement, that these are adult content in many instances. And the obsession of the left to try and push these, look, who knows the answer to that, other than to say, I don't think there'd be too many Australians that have any difficulty with the ABC trying to stick to its lane and reporting on. Why don't we be generous? Why don't they stick to their lane and report on on climate change exclusively from now on and leave it at that?
Don't give them ideas. Now, you made a speech in Parliament this week highlighting how the activist class, together with Labor and the Greens, are fanning the flames of historical grievances. What is that doing to race relations in this country?
Well, I mean, I think you have to only really look at the recent events. I don't think we've been more divided on this topic than prior to The Voice. I think it dredged up a lot of ill feeling and ill will, and Aussies ultimately quite rightly rejected that division. But we see this all the time. I mean, I was struck this week on our first week back at Parliament, walking into the building. I mean, really, if Aussies want to understand how out of step with mainstream Australia this building has become, and how in tune with inner city Australia, it feels like walking into the offices of Ultima, I've got to say, Parliament House, under this government. You will see it there. The building, however, and all of the bureaucrats and the lobbyists and the media class that inhabit that building are obsessed with this topic. And I don't think it's doing us any favour. It certainly doesn't seem to be addressing the real issues in remote communities. So whatever it is doing, we appear to be going backwards on this subject, and yet we never seem to have had people screaming about racial division and radical, racial theory and all sorts of things. But it seems to be pushing the dial in the wrong direction. And The Voice shows that Aussies want to be unified and not divided. Senator,
you also mentioned in your speech that it doesn't seem to be really about reconciliation anymore. It seems to be more about retribution. Do you really see that as the mindset of the activist class?
Yeah, look, I really do, Rita. I think that if you look at the concept of reconciliation, we're talking about an act that was wrong and then some form of forgiveness. And it doesn't strike me that there is any evidence that the activist class really want to see that historical grievance industry come to an end. I mean, after all, it's good for business. Ultimately, though, I want to know when we've reconciled. Ultimately, I mean, it becomes a question of how many times and how many different initiatives have to be involved in order to get to this point. And I don't think we're going to see that out of the activist class. We see that on a range of issues. There are never going to be enough emissions reduction targets, by the way. This is what the left do. They're always slicing away at the salami. And this concept of reconciliation, however noble it may be in some people's minds, where is the end point on this? And, when do we know when we've reconciled, Rita?
Now, I do think it's time to rethink this entire agenda. All the empty virtue signalling, the welcome to country, the acknowledgement of country, all those things that are designed to appease the activist class, I think the overwhelming majority of Australians would rather do away with. Before you go, I want to show you some footage from Spain where farmers are protesting the environmental policies of the European Union. Have a look at this footage of police blocking the roads to stop the farmers. But guess what? They're in tractors, Senator, so they just go through the field and around the police roadblock. But on a serious note, there is this growing global movement against these daft environmental policies, particularly in Europe. Is there going to be a loosening of green farming requirements? Do our farmers have something to fear about what we're seeing in places like the Netherlands and Spain?
Seems like the Spanish police are now made up entirely out of Manuel from 40 Towers. It's staggering that that happened. It's like the Maginot Line. They just went around the other side of it. But good on them for doing it. I mean, if you want to see passion, you'll see it out of European farmers, French, German and Spanish now. And they're all protesting the same thing, which is the use of this so-called climate apocalypse to shut down farming in the name of the climate. I think this is a growing trend. I am very gladdened, though, to see that there is some pushback from the farmers in Europe. And I say it to farmers here in Australia all the time, don't think that the powers that be in Australia aren't coming for your farming as well. This is all about climate change being used as a way of, shutting down this sort of industry. And, of course, we know, the sensible Australians know that there's no farmers, there's no food. So I want to see, I want to see this come to an end. This kind of climate nonsense has got to stop. I mean, we cannot have farmers being put through this here in Australia.
Senator Alex Antic, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks, Rita.